Welcome. We are here for our next episode of Sebastian and Sierp. We're so glad you've joined us. We are here today with Dr. Paul Vincelli, who has been a professor at the University of Kentucky for
29 years.
29 years. And Paul is here today to tell us a lot of great things about all things plants and genetic engineering and a lot of really cool stuff. So we're really looking forward to hearing from him today. Paul, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Chip. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And of course, we've got Aaron in the backdrop handling all kinds of good things back there.
All the technical end of the business.
So I've really been looking forward to having you on, and I was one of the premises of this show we were discussing earlier is really trying to separate the wheat from the chaff regarding a lot of the material that's online. If it's like a lot of other things that we focused on the show, I'm sure that there are plenty of misconceptions, misunderstandings, problems in the thinking with all things related to crops and engineering and growing things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah. It's, the topic of genetic engineering of crops, or which are sometimes called GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. We're talking about the same thing. So when I say genetic engineering, I'm referring to what the public commonly thinks of as GMOs. The topic of GMOs is very controversial in most quarters, not everywhere. And consequently, I think people have often strong opinions about the topic, but sometimes with need opportunities, let's say, for further discussion of the science. And so when you invited me onto the program or the podcast, I thought, well, this is great, because I generally really enjoy talking about the science of genetic engineering, what it does, how it works, and what are some of the concerns. It's just a neat topic to talk about, and so we'll go as deep as we're able into this program.
Now, you, in a sense, are in charge of some outreach in this regard too.
Yes.
So it's not just that you are a professor in the lab. We're here in Paul's lab, but it's not just that. You actually are partially responsible for getting a lot of good information out to the community and the world about this, right?
Right. One of the areas of responsibility that I have for the University of Kentucky is to provide outreach on genetic engineering. And again, when we come at it as professors, our focus is not to promote the technology or to demote the technology, but to try to provide the scientific basis for the technology and to understand its weaknesses as well. So that's something I've been doing for the university for about 5 years. In fact, I started in this topic. Your listeners may be interested to know something here. I have never genetically engineered a plant. I've genetically engineered microorganisms for diagnostic purposes. So I know the technology, but I've never genetically engineered a plant. And so you could look at that and say, well, does he know what he's talking about? And yes, I do. I work very hard to make sure my outreach is grounded in modern science, and my outreach is peer reviewed. So I mean, it's very solid. It's my obligation to you is to provide the best scientific information. But there's a plus side to never having genetically engineered a plant. I have nothing at stake. I have no grants. I have no awards from industry or anything like that have to do with this topic. So really, I have no incentive to give you anything other than the very best science.
Very nice. Because this is a huge concern in your field, isn't it? That there may be people who get a huge kickback from some big company, or they become the shill type of character who may have some expertise of a sort, whether it's higher education or maybe they grew up farming and learned, whatever it is,
Right.
But somehow, some way they get tied in giving maybe information that's not in the best interest of the public or in the best interest of just people in general or our future. And so I guess I'm sure that does occur, and I won't ask you to cite specific examples of that, but have you noticed, since you've been in this role for the past 5 years with outreach, have you noticed you run into people like that, and also people who don't know what they're talking about?
Yeah, I actually, I don't accept, as I communicated to you before the program, I don't accept any funds whatsoever on genetic engineering, so that I can maintain that distance, because if you accept a $500 grant from a seed company, you're tarred forever, in this topic. And I don't want to lose that credibility with the public. So I've never taken any outreach or any grant money or anything like that with respect to genetic engineering in crops. I actually think that really good scientists can work for industry or be funded by industry. I mean, there are some really good people that work in industry, and so in defense of them, I want to say that it's not it doesn't immediately, accepting money or working for an industry doesn't immediately kick them out of credibility in my mind. It does, logically raise that question. All right, so what's their motivation here? Because they're working for some big seed company, so maybe that's going to influence their motivations, like it can with researchers on pharmaceuticals. But on the other hand, we don't throw out pharmaceutical research entirely because it was funded by industry, because there can be some very good studies in industry, and that we see that with seeds as well. So I do respect that the public wants that distance, and so I maintain that distance. And I just want to maintain my credibility, but I will say that can be some very good people working in association with industry that whose opinion I respect and at least listen to.
Gotcha. You had sent us a video in preparation for today of a demonstration with cards on how genetic engineering actually works, and what we're going to do is cut away to that right now so Paul doesn't have to do it here, and that way you can look at it, watch this video, just so as the conversation progresses, if you don't understand genetic engineering, at least to a small degree, hopefully this will give you some understanding, and we'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Paul Vincelli. I'm an extension professor of plant pathology at the University of Kentucky. And thanks for coming to look at this demonstration. What I'm going to demonstrate is a way to understand two different techniques for crop improvement. One is hybridization, sometimes called crossing of plants. And the other is called genetic engineering, or at least one of the forms of genetic engineering. And both techniques are quite important in crop improvement. But there are some differences, and it's interesting to understand how these different approaches are different. So first of all, you can see I have 4 decks of cards. They're quite normal decks of cards. And so I'm just going to consolidate these. And you can see here on the left, we have the red parent. So now we're thinking in terms of crop improvement. So the red parent is a variety that grows and performs very well in local circumstances out on farms, but it's missing a gene for resistance to a particular disease. So we're very happy with this red parent. We really don't want to change it very much, but we do want to introduce that resistance gene. So here on this side we have the blue parent, and the blue parent is not really a very good variety in terms of commercial production. It doesn't grow well. Maybe it produces small fruits that are not very tasty. In any case, it's not a desirable plant to grow on farms, but it does have a particular quality of having a gene for resistance to the disease that we're concerned about. So we're going to use the 5 of hearts as that gene that we're interested in. So you can see that I'm placing that gene into the blue decks that you can see here. They're not present in the red decks, but they will be, and that's the whole idea of crop improvement. So we're going to take these decks as examples, and I'm going to demonstrate hybridization. And so we have the blue parent and the red parent, and we're going to hybridize those. And so clearly we've introduced the blue, the 5 of hearts, the gene of interest. So we're glad about that, but we've dramatically changed the genetics of the red parent, because now we have 50% of its genes coming from the blue parent. And since the blue parent is not a very good performer, we're going to end up with a plant that isn't particularly a good performer on farms, even though it has this resistance gene. So what a breeder would do then is do a series of techniques called backcrossing to get rid of as many of these blue genes as he or she can. But you never get rid of them all through conventional breeding. And so, so there is always this possibility of permanently altering the genetics of the red parent, even though we have introduced a gene that we care about. Again, that 5 of hearts, which gives it a level of disease resistance that it needs. So you can see the advantage of hybridization was to bring in that resistance gene, but the disadvantages were changing the genetics potentially rather substantially. So the idea with genetic engineering is illustrated with the same objective. We want to get that resistance gene into the red parent. But instead of hybridizing and mixing all these genes, with genetic engineering, we identify this gene and we move it into the red parent. So we've not introduced a whole slug of new genes. We're only introducing the one gene of interest in this case. And so we've caused much, much, much less genetic change to the red parent. And so that's an advantage of genetic engineering. In fact, many scientists refer to genetic engineering as a form of precision breeding. And there you can see the reason why.
And we're back. So, Paul.
Yes, sir.
Please illuminate for us the advantages of genetically engineered or modified crops.
Right. So that's a really good question, and I probably will think of things as we go through the interview that won't all come up now. But looking at the reasons for genetic engineering, I think as you're asking is a very good point. So in its most extreme, what you can do with genetic engineering usually is you can take essentially a gene from a distant organism, evolutionarily distant organism, and put it into a plant, and it will function typically. So that means we could go all the way to a bacterium out of the soil or out of your intestine and find a gene that might be really useful in a plant in that microorganism. And if we copy and paste that gene into our plant, then usually we'll find it functions. You know, which is, and that itself is interesting. But the reason a gene from foreign organisms functions at all is because the alphabet of DNA is the same across basically all organisms. Okay?
And here you're talking about the amino acids that constitute
that get coded by the DNA.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So the DNA alphabet, by the way, for listeners, is composed of 4 letters, not 26 like our regular alphabet. But with those 4 letters, in whatever combination they are found in nature, you can copy and paste that into another organism, and it will largely function. Maybe not always, but that, we can find out in the laboratory if it's functioning or not. So probably the biggest advantage of genetic engineering, and maybe the thing that some people would be squeamish about, is the very fact that you can take a gene out of a distant microorganism, evolutionarily distant microorganism or some other organism, put it into a plant, and it functions. And that's a strength because, as far as a biologist is concerned, because maybe the plant that we're interested in doesn't have the capacity to make provitamin A, for example, like rice. Doesn't produce provitamin A. Well, what if we took a single gene from another plant, for example, and put it into rice and produce rice that would produce provitamin A so that children won't go blind in Southeast Asia? Well, that's a pretty powerful, reason to do that.
Sure.
There are downsides too, but so one advantage, to get back to your question, is this ability to move genes around, really according to what we perceive to be the greatest benefit. That's probably the biggest one. But even beyond that, even if we say, well, we don't want to take genes from foreign organisms and move them around, and some people feel that way, and that's certainly, everyone's right. But what if you stay within the gene pool? So now we're not talking about a gene from a distant microorganism. We're talking about a gene from within potatoes, because wild potatoes and cultivated potatoes can interbreed, maybe not easily, but they interbreed. So what if we just took a gene from a wild potato and put it into a potato that you're familiar with, like russet Burbank? You might think, well, why would you want to even do that? If they interbreed, let's just use conventional breeding. But if you do, conventional breeding doesn't always work very well in all plants and all crops. It does work better in some than others. So in potatoes, it's kind of hard to really cross a wild potato with a cultivated potato and still end up with a cultivated potato. Okay,
Conventional breeding take significantly longer than...
Yes, if you can succeed at all in doing what you want to do with conventional breeding, it's often going to be longer. It's usually going to be longer. And so that would be, that's exactly the point with using the potato example. You take a gene from a wild potato, and instead of crossing them and hybridizing and taking 30 years, I'm not exaggerating, maybe 30 years to get where you want to be in the breeding process, maybe it'll take 6 months or a year with genetic engineering, using the card example. So those are just some of the reasons why scientists are slow to throw out these technologies. They're not always the best technologies. If conventional breeding does what we need to do in the time frame we want to do it, then that's great. But if we can't get to a particular breeding goal through conventional breeding, that's where genetic engineering shines, is because we can do so many things with genetics. Oh, and one more thing, I'm sort of on a roll here, Chip, and I know you've got some questions, but
no, this is good stuff.
But one of the things that surprises people too is to know that genetic engineering is based on our knowledge of nature. Nothing we do is beyond the realm of nature. We actually got the ideas for what to do in genetic engineering, how to do it, what might be some of the outcomes we want to shoot for. We got all these from studying nature. These are
so this was already naturally occurring. So much like when the movie camera was invented, someone said that's kind of like a human eye.
Yeah.
And it's recording information.
Yeah.
And so a scientist says, hey, we're seeing genes multiply and we're seeing them cross and intersect.
Yes.
And so maybe we can replicate that in the lab. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying. So let me give you the premier example of that. So the concept of genetic engineering, of taking a gene from a foreign organism and sticking it in another organism, was actually first discovered in nature. There is a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. That's the Latin name, the binomial name. And it's actually a plant pathogen, so we plant pathologists study it all of our students study it in our classes. And so what it took this particular pathogen, this bacterium, causes tumors on plants. And so medical scientists started studying it back in I don't want to say which decade, but maybe 50 or 60 years ago. They thought maybe it can teach us something about cancer. And so they studied how it caused these tumors, and they determined that it caused these growth tumors in plants by inserting some of its DNA in the plant.
Okay.
And so that's what genetic engineering is. Here's a bacterium that's naturally genetically engineering its host. And so biologists said, well, wait a minute, if it's genetically modifying the plant, why don't we use that same molecular toolkit that the bacterium produces to engineer plants with the genes that we want? And that is the whole that led to genetic engineering. So even the concept of genetic engineering came from the study of nature, where we discovered that a that there is this natural genetic engineer out in nature.
And so as it progressed on and as the scientific method developed, you'd be looking at, well, okay, if it's happening naturally and it's causing these tumors in crops or in plants, how could we maybe reverse engineer it or extract that gene if that's possible, or even introduce another gene that would override the old gene? And does that become the issue or the...
Yeah, that's a good question. So you mean the issue in what sense? You mean?
Well, I mean, in other words, just for an understanding for our listeners, because I think there is a lot of conception and misconception about, well, if someone is genetically engineering anything, then what they're doing is playing God.
Sure.
And that's horrible, and it's going to create the end of the world and all these kind of fear-based things that maybe aren't grounded in the science you're talking about. And so the question I was posing was, as the years rolled on and as science developed and the Enlightenment occurred and so on and so forth, did it become this thing of well, okay, we see in nature how this gene has been introduced naturally, and here it produces a stronger organism or plant or crop or whatever. Here it creates cancer and a lot of other problems. So how can we figure out how to either reverse engineer what's causing the disease, and we'll take the good stuff that's happening naturally, and we'll take that and work with it more and capitalize on it and all that. But over here, was that the thinking for?
Well, it was actually, I realized by describing the tumor-inducing process of this bacterium, I realized I may be giving listeners the impression that this bacterium causes cancer. It does not cause cancer in animals. It doesn't infect animals. So I
mean in the plant itself.
Okay.
The plant itself. No, not.
So I think I think the idea was to see if we could learn something about cancer by studying this organism, but it really it turns out it teaches us nothing about cancer in humans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like it's so radically different.
It's so radically different from
cancer.
Mammalian cancer,
Yeah, okay.
exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
So, yeah, but it became, but the utility of it became this. We became able to make genetically engineered plants using this technology that we discovered in nature, and in fact we've become more sophisticated even beyond what we can do with that toolbox in the last it's I guess 10 years. We've become more sophisticated in the way we can engineer plants, even going beyond this bacterium, Agrobacterium tumefaciens. So we maybe we'll have time to talk about CRISPR gene editing as well.
Right. Well, we can talk about it right now.
Segue right into it.
Yeah, because honestly, I don't understand CRISPR.
Sure.
I don't. So please tell us all.
Absolutely, glad to. So I can do this in a couple ways. One is, all right, so thinking back to the card deck, where we inserted a card and the card was the gene. So another way to think of a gene for your listeners is to think of copying and pasting a sentence out of a file on the computer. We've all done that. We all know that you can copy and paste copy a sentence from out of file A and insert it into file B, and there's no harm. And in fact, the file B might even read better. That's the whole idea, right? So that's what genetic engineering. That's probably the best analogy of all. And I've had this vetted with genomics experts, and they all seem to like it as a way to teach the people what genetic engineering is. So with Agrobacterium tumefaciens, this 40-year-old technology that still works, by the way, it's still useful. When you can copy a gene faithfully, you can insert a gene faithfully. That is, the gene that you expect there, it's there. But you don't control where it goes in the genetics.
Oh, so it's like you throw it in the soup, but you don't know where it's going to end up in the soup.
Exactly. That is actually not a serious problem, but that's the reality. Is you have to do 100 or 200 plants to get 1 or 5 or 10 that have an insertion in a place that doesn't harm the plant.
So how does this? I heard the term bombardment. Is that kind of the same thing but done on a lot?
Yeah, boy, that's a good. All right, so that's a perfectly timed question. So using the bacterium to insert the gene randomly, okay, is that's the disadvantage of the bacterial approach, the agrobacterium approach. Another approach which is old, but still works, is called the gene gun, and that's what I think you're referring to, this bombardment. So imagine that you've got these microscopic pellets of gold or tungsten, all right, and you coat those with the gene of interest. You can actually put the gene solution on the outside of these microparticles.
Are they pellets or?
Yeah, the micropellets. They're microscopic pellets. And you shoot those into a plant leaf, and then coax a plant to grow out of that leaf, which you can do in the lab. So that insertion technique, then you're bombarding the plant with gene-coated pellets. As I say, it's called the gene gun, and that technology is useful, but it still introduces randomly, right? So the only real downside of this technology is the random insertion.
So is that similar to grafting but on a micro level?
No, grafting is you actually have two plants with different genetics, similar genetics but not identical, that are fused into one plant. But so it's like if we grafted my arm onto your arm, my arm on you would still have my genetics, and the rest of your body would still be your genetics. That's grafting. This genetic engineering, you're actually inserting the gene into a cell of the plant, which then becomes the whole plant and the whole crop and the whole field. So the downside of the older technology is it works, it's good, it's still useful, and people use it. But the downside is you get these random insertions. It's not a big roadblock, but it sounds worse than it actually is. It's not a big deal. A lot of randomness happens in genetics, naturally. Yeah. Oh.
We see it every day.
Yeah. Nature is loco with genetics. I mean, it does crazy things.
But the gold and the tungsten you mentioned, do those serve as catalysts to carry the gene? Is that the reason?
Well, they use those because they're not reactive in the cell, so that's why you.
So there wouldn't be any kind of alteration if you attached the genetic material to those elements.
Right. The genetic material just releases from the pellets, and then they're no longer part of the plant as it grows.
It just flushes out.
It flushes
through
out.
the process.
Yeah, it just remains part of that original cell, but then the plant grows, and everything else is free from the tungsten pellets.
So the idea is that when you put these genes in there, they kind of know where to go.
They get into the nucleus and integrate into the chromosomes somehow. Yeah. And I think it's just the sheer force of the shooting, or the natural genetic engineer kind of guides that process, the bacterial approach. But so now if you understand, that is the basic of the older technologies of genetic engineering, this random element, but still useful. Now imagine that you could put the gene right where you want it.
So that's where we are today.
That's what CRISPR does.
That's what CRISPR does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And that's what scientists said when they first read about it. Wow.
So where did that technology originate?
It originated again from the study of nature. So there are turns out quite a few bacterial species which have a natural defense mechanism which was discovered, let's say about 10 to 12 years ago. And the way this natural defense mechanism works is so it's a bacterium that's infected by a virus, not a virus that is human infecting, but a virus that infects bacteria. And to save itself and its future offspring, what it does is it captures at somewhere between 20 and 40, I think it's maybe closer to 20, 25 letters of DNA from the virus. It captures 25 letters from the virus and puts it into its own genetics. So now it's got a piece of the virus DNA that it's carrying.
So is that the same thing our immune systems do when we get
Virus
start
comes in,
developing
and
some
then
kind of immunity?
We don't do that technology. That was invented by bacteria in nature, but it's the same concept. It's the same. It's like an immune system, but instead of it being protein based, it's storing the information in genetic code right in its own body, and so I know it was such a cool thing to discover.
Wow.
I know.
That's very cool.
And when they first discovered it, nobody realized, oh, this could be useful. They just did it because scientists are curious. But when they realized, oh, what if we could use that to manipulate the genetics of plants we're interested in, or animals or humans? What if we could do that? And of course, that blew open the doors in biology.
Right. That's awesome.
Oh, it's
so,
amazing.
so CRISPR is that an analogy?
Yeah,
Or an acronym?
An acronym. Yeah, it's clustered, regularly interspaced palindromic repeats, and so it's named after the phenomenon of the arrangement of the DNA in the bacterium. They didn't even think it would be useful. They didn't come up with a cute name for it. They just described it. You know,
So this is what it's doing.
this is what you'll see if
that's
you
awesome.
look.
So is that after it modifies its genetic body, does that become hereditary? Does that move on?
That captured DNA from the virus in the bacterium that do this is hereditary. It stays. Yeah, I mean, eventually they may lose it if they don't need it, but if they don't get exposed to that virus again in a long time. But when you use CRISPR, so explaining how CRISPR works, we could go into some more depth on that too. It all depends on which direction you want to go in. But you use CRISPR to make genetic changes in plants is my focus. Although you can do this in livestock, and,
In humans.
in humans, yeah, which is, of course, introduces all kinds of,
We want this guy to have X-ray vision.
Yeah.
We want this guy
No, somebody may be thinking about that.
Yeah, it's super simple.
It'll happen.
It'll happen.
Yeah.
So, but you do make genetic changes that are hereditary through CRISPR, and that's of course what you're after when you use the technology.
So with that in mind, companies that are, major food producing companies can, unlike before, now say, well, we're going to make this exactly the way we want it. We can have, however many tons of this yield, and we know we can rely on that. So does that make for a more reliable crop and yield?
Yeah, no, you're dead on. Actually, I'll tell you something you might find interesting. When I went to a CRISPR conference out in Berkeley, California, it was a major opportunity to learn about the technology. They asked us. They did a little survey with our phones, and there was maybe 300 people there, and they asked how many were which sector do you represent? Medical, crops, livestock. Therapeutic, pharmaceutical, and so on and so forth. Fully half of the people there were from agriculture, and so that kind of surprised me. But it means that I think, to speak to your point, Chip, agriculture sees money-making opportunities.
Sure.
As
they should.
As they
should, in the sense of it's serving people better.
Yes.
Right. Because if you say, well, there's still areas of the world that don't have food. And if we could, make crops that are, let's say, stronger and more resistant to certain strains, by the time we ship them to this third world country, we're going to have 90% of it left instead of 20% of it left.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Yeah.
When I was in Africa a few weeks ago, I went to Uganda and had a chance to see some of their genetic engineering work in the field, and I can feel emotion around this. It was quite beautiful to see what they've achieved. And this is going to sound odd to listeners who may be opposed to genetic engineering, but I'm a plant pathologist, and I know how difficult it can be to control certain types of diseases. And so here we were, out in a very well protected facility, so that that it was they were under containment. But there were these cassava plants, which is a staple crop for many Africans and many people throughout the world. and like a starchy vegetable-y, well, starchy staple really is. It's a starchy root crop, and there are certain virus diseases that, especially cassava brown streak virus, which don't have a conventional control. There's no control for this virus, even through conventional breeding, and yet here they had engineered cassava plants to be resistant to several viruses, including cassava brown streak virus, and the plants that were not engineered, this was all natural infection. This is all natural inoculum, so it wasn't anything contrived that they did. The plants that were affected by cassava brown streak virus were about to my belt, okay, right, which is quite short.
Right.
And then the roots that they harvest from those are going to be very few, and they're going to be all mottled inside and for flavor. And then the plants that were engineered to be resistant to virus with quite minimal engineering, by the way. It was just a very targeted portion of the virus that they inserted. They were to the ceiling in this room, so 10 feet high. And I was just so moved by that because there are many people. The farmers, when they see these results in Uganda, they're like, "Why did you have us come out and see this? If you can't give it to us, we want it now." So anyway, that's an example of why genetic engineering is often considered useful. But I do want to give voice to the notion that there are concerns too. You brought up one, playing God, and that's a concern some people have. I always respond in the following way. I always say that now we're in the topic of values. We're getting into the should kinds of senses. Should we do this or should we do that? And that is something science can inform, but has no special claim to. In other words, your position on genetically engineered crops can differ from mine based on values, and we may have both very solid value-based positions, but I always I try not to talk people out of their opinion if it's based on values. That's my job, is to get the science out in front of the people so they can make their own values-based judgment. That's my approach.
Sure. Well, and I think along with that, there's this issue of your own compassion and your own humanity, in terms of there is the science, and you just can't argue with that. But for those people who have had a long, decades long history of hearing stuff in the media or in films or in bad books or from people who don't know what they're talking about concerning genetics gone wrong, people think genetic engineering, they immediately think, are they doing that on humans? Is this Nazi Germany?
Right.
That's where people's minds go.
Yeah.
But having the real clear image of, no, this is actually what this is, and it's not all that perpetuated stuff to sell books and movies or bad tabloids or whatever. No, this is what this is, and if the person doing it has this compassion and humanity, like maybe the entire world could get fed if we do this right.
Well,
I mean, those are two different things besides let's experiment on humans.
Yeah.
And we're trying to feed millions of children. I mean, those are two.
The concern is that it's the same technology, having the ability.
Sure.
And then who's controlling it, how we're using it.
Yeah.
Sure.
North Korea or wherever may not use it in the same way that Iran choose to use it.
Sure. Well, I mean, the same thing's been going on with stem cells now for years, right? And people, when that first came out, it was just such a big. Now it's kind of tapering off because people are seeing, wow, my shoulder's actually working now because I did stem cell. And so you have to say, well, am I easing human suffering? Is it the best thing for the race?
Yeah.
Or are we just stuck in this mindset of fear? And stem cells bad. Stem cells bad.
Well, I tend to think. Again, I know I sound like a promoter of genetic engineering, but honestly, I can't hide from the fact that I think the technology is useful and deserves to be used in wise ways. I think we're probably going to look back and, I don't know if it's 10 years, 20, 50 years, but people are going to accept the technology because it's too useful. It's just very...
It works.
It works. It does good things. And even in spite of the fact that, yes, there are, the large multinational corporations that haven't, always behaved in ways that are defensible, and the concern that you brought up, Aaron, that who's controlling this technology. That I have good friends that are concerned that multinationals are empowered because of these technologies. Even with those concerns on the table, I tend to think that there is a lot of there's too much value in what we can do. And I gave that example from Uganda as just merely one. There are just so many projects that are sitting on shelves in laboratories or published but not being used because if you can't market, if you can't commercialize what you've done.
Yeah, the drugs for rare diseases that don't get made and people are dying. And of course,
I have a question. This is a little bit aggressive for the conversation, but I heard about them trying to use something called terminator seeds for produced plants that are infertile, I guess. But then I also heard there was some kind of large backlash against that, and they don't do that for some reason. What was the reason that they chose to let that go?
Yeah, so the terminator technology is the production of seeds that can produce a crop but then are infertile.
Sterile.
Yeah, and sterile. And so actually the technology was adapted once again from what we find in nature. So it's actually technology that we sort of co-opted from nature. But your concern is bigger than where did this come from. Are we creating crops that are maybe can't be saved, right? The seeds can't be saved. It was never commercialized because of the backlash that occurred. You're absolutely right. There was a backlash. So I'm quite confident that there is not a single case of actual application. It was just too controversial. One of the ideas was to use the technology to keep people from saving seed, so they'd have to come back and buy seed. But the other reason for the technology was so that if you've got all right, so let me introduce a term. So transgene is a gene from a foreign organism, right? So if it's a gene from a wild potato into a cultivated potato, that's not a transgene. But if it's from a bacterium into potato, that is a transgene. That's from a foreign organism. So the transgenes can move in pollen, and that would be one of the
pollen?
In pollen.
Pollen, okay.
Yeah, so we can loop back and talk about that issue. That would be one that I would rank as a significant issue for and concern. But one of probably the best ways to control the flow of transgenes in nature is through the terminator gene, and so actually that was probably a good thing, but a good application. But either way, it's not been used.
So the concern was that genetically modified plants would crossbreed with, I guess what you would call what do they call them?
Just conventional plants.
Yeah, conventional plants or there's another term for it. Heirloom plants.
Oh yeah. Good term. Yeah. And so maybe I can imagine a circumstance where you would have transgenes, terminator technology in a field, and maybe the neighboring field is an heirloom variety. So there might be some need to pay attention to, this proper distance and so on. So there's not a problem there. But I mean, that's a it's a legitimate issue that hopefully would be addressable through wise use. But again, the terminator technology has not been used because of the controversy associated with it.
You think it'll blow over eventually?
I don't know.
It seems like so many of these things that are new ideas are explosive at first, and then as they die down and their true value is sort of mete it out and find out well this actually is good.
Yeah, it could be. That'd be a good question for discussion in a graduate course.
Right. Yeah.
Under what circumstances might this be acceptable?
Right. Yeah. Good.
Giving away seeds or something.
Yeah. Good qualifying exam topic or something.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty.
Watch out, students.
That's
Take
right.
note.
Actually, Lisa Tessman. I think you know Lisa.
Sounds familiar.
She's over at our dance studio, and so I was telling her I was going to interview you, and she said, "Oh yeah, I know Dr. Vincelli," and she just finished her PhD.
Oh.
And so she's probably going to watch this and go,
"Oh, good.
How's he doing that? How's he making difficult topics?" So.
Yeah.
I wanted to. So there's been this huge push here for years now, and a lot of it's with Elon Musk and a few other companies concerning habitable life on, particularly Mars, right?
Yeah.
At some point, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? But could you talk? Now, I know it's a little far fetched, but can you talk about the possibility of would we be able to create a sustainable thing and have crop yields on another planet? To kind of terraform it in some way to.
It's really just a lack of water, isn't it? I mean, you could probably do that.
Yeah. Boy, yeah, there was a great movie that came out a couple years ago. Martian. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Probably showed just how difficult it probably is.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder, so, now we're into the speculative, of course, but as long as we know we're speculating, we can do that.
All reality started speculatively, right?
That's right.
I mean, nobody thought we'd go to the moon in the early 60s, right?
We did. So,
actually, some people say we still
yeah,
don't know.
that's right. Yeah, more than
I had some guy tell me that it was fake because the flag was straight and
he doesn't know
like
that they're put in a bar.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's like anyway. So
okay. So anyway, I think if I were responsible for feeding people on a distant colony, out in space, I'm thinking microorganisms. Because you can grow yeasts and bacteria pretty easily as long as you keep things, you maintain sanity and stuff like that, and sanitation or sanity could be that too. But actually, as delicious as Brussels sprouts are and the plants we're used to, you probably do much better at in the space provided with fermenters of microorganisms to make pressed cakes. So there are commercial products out there that are microbially based, even in the supermarket. So those would be, I would expect plants would be just too space consuming to do on a colony, a space colony. I would go for microorganisms because of the sheer abundance and the control you get in a fermenter.
Yeah. So instead of having like huge corn plants or something, all that would be compressed down to like 10% of the space required.
Yeah.
You could still get the same nutrients.
Yep. Yeah, but it'd be pretty boring, I think, because it's pressed cakes of whatever you're growing.
Well, and I guess my thoughts have drifted to. I know that at this point there have been a few instances of finding water on. I think one of Jupiter's moons, I believe they found water on, and so my thoughts run to what kind of crops would grow under those circumstances, given that there is water. Would that be possible? Would it be a totally different type of vegetation? Would we even call it vegetation?
Yeah.
It's fascinating to think about.
That we have planted there.
No. I mean like there are, like, I know that on the one moon their water had been detected.
Right.
They're like a reservoir of water or an ocean of water. Okay. And then it seems like there were 2 or 3 other places where H2O was found.
Right.
And that being kind of the main ingredient for a lot of vegetation here, I'm just wondering, would weird things grow in different ways?
I would expect that, once again, being a microbiologist, I guess, and a plant scientist, I think of microorganisms as the eminently adaptable, life forms on this earth. So, they've been around for most of the, really since life could be formed at all, and for most of the time of Earth's existence, it's been primarily microbials, and they're so adaptive. I mean, some live in thermal hot springs, or
right.
deep sea vents.
Thermophiles.
Yeah, so they're just incredibly adaptable. So I'd be looking for evidence of life, but probably microbial life in that case.
Yeah, wouldn't that be fascinating?
Oh, man.
We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. At Kyojuteru Kempo, we believe that everyone has the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. Violence can visit us despite age, race, or gender. Call us at Kyojuteru Kempo or check us out at kyojuteru.org. kyojuteru.org. Hello, I'm Chip Sebastian. I am the co-host of Sebastian Sierp. If you've been liking the shows, please click like down below. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, jump on over to YouTube, click subscribe, and you will get the most recent episodes of our show where we're interviewing all kinds of great and interesting people. So we're looking forward to a lot more shows. Stay tuned. It's rolling. Just begun. And we're back right here at Sebastian and Sierp. Paul, once again, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great conversation as far as I'm concerned.
I'm enjoying it, Chip.
Yeah, it's wonderful. We're going to ask, something I was interested in. I'd read some time ago about, and you can let me know if you don't want to talk about this.
Yeah, sure.
But I'd read some time ago about issues of nuclear testing of things that we've done during the war and after regarding nuclear fallout and so on and so forth, Chernobyl, things of that nature, permanently affecting the genetics of the crops and the foods we eat in such a way that's irreparable. Is there any credence to that, or is that effective?
Man, I have never seen that discussed or in a journal or in a scientific conference.
What's something that came to my mind? I mean, I read this, and it was more of a speculative thing.
Yeah, okay.
But given the nature of nuclear physics and how if something is irradiated, it stays for so long, and has such a long life.
Right.
And must be affecting things in some way.
Yeah, I probably want to see. I mean, I think one of the qualities a good scientist has to have is open-mindedness, and the other is skepticism, and
Sure.
you have to balance both to be a good scientist. So I'm open to the idea. I'd want to see, what the concerns were in writing with evidence, if at all possible. I have some skepticism. First, because as I mentioned, I haven't ever seen this discussed. There doesn't seem to be any lingering concern in the scientific community. Again, if it's there, I've missed it. And the other reason I would say it doesn't it doesn't bubble up for me as a concern is because there's a technology of conventional breeding. This is not GMO stuff, genetic engineering. This is conventional breeding. It's called mutation breeding. And mutation breeding is where you expose plant material to powerful mutagenic circumstances. So it could be gamma irradiation, which is high energy radiation.
Like the Hulk.
And the other is through powerful chemical mutagens, things that are really dangerous to handle. And so you have to, if you're doing this mutation breeding, you have to be very, very careful. Then you after the period of exposure to these mutation creating conditions, you remove your seed from or your plant material from those circumstances. So the radiation no longer exists in your plant material.
Okay.
But it's been mutagenized, usually very heavily, badly mutagenized, to the point where a lot of the seeds or the plant material is killed. But some of it survives. It may grow very spindly and weakly, but it may have certain properties that are desirable. And so you take those plants that have desirable qualities and you use them in your breeding program.
So the mutations would be completely random?
The mutations would be completely random, yeah. And you're looking for those. You want those in mutation breeding. So what you've done, it sounds like a crazy thing to do, but if you keep in mind that a breeder wants genetic variation, they always want genetic variation so they can find things that are useful from among those variants. So that's what they're doing, is they're kind of speeding up natural mutation, maybe 100-fold or 1,000-fold, some crazy number, to the point where you're killing this plant material, but some of it survives, and those might be useful plants. So if there was any impact on our crops, it would diminish over time, and it's no different than what happens in nature anyway, or mutation breeding anyway, to really take an extreme example. So that's my first impulse. I've not read about this issue, the Chernobyl concerns, but I don't think
it wasn't Chernobyl per se, but I'm just talking about nuclear testing in general. Altering just sort of the atomic field.
Oh, I see.
And in other words, if we were to sit down to dinner in 1910, or let's make it 1890, pre Marie Curie, all right?
Okay. Yeah.
and we were to have corn and green beans and whatever, they would be of a slightly different variety genetically, or they would be unaffected genetically, as if versus today.
Right. I'd still say the same. Mutations happen all the time in nature.
Yeah.
And so, and they happen as a result of natural processes. So even if, I'm not defending the atomic energy or the nuclear industry or anything like that, but even if there were residual impacts of atomic bomb testing, for example, I think it'd probably be pretty low on the list of
would it be more likely to be in the soil if that was the case versus?
So the source of radiation might be something that ends up in the
soil versus like these plants got irradiated somehow. It became part of their genetic material. They proliferated, and their offspring were, carried that as a result.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I think if it's in the soil, probably has even less impact because it's not getting up into the germplasm, the propagated
the soil would be
material.
replenishing itself in a probably cleaner way too, wouldn't it? Through just
it might. Yeah.
Probably.
It's be worth looking into more, but I'm not.
Highly skeptical.
Doesn't raise a concern for me.
Yeah, and like I said, this is part of the reason we like doing this stuff, because we don't know, and it seems like nowadays, I don't know how it is in your field, but even in some of the refereed journals that I read about stuff I actually know about, I know some of it's wrong. I know some of it's hasn't been double-blind studied, and yet, I think some of that depends on the journal itself and who's doing the refereeing.
Peer review is an excellent. It's like democracy. It's the best. It's the best thing we've got, but it's better than all the other alternatives. But it's still not very good.
You're quoting Churchill again. That's good.
Yeah. Was that Churchill?
It was Churchill. Yeah.
Yeah. So
democracy's democracy's the worst thing out there, but it's It's the worst of the best or something like that.
Best of what's available.
Best of what's available.
So peer review, it's the same thing. Peer review papers can be weak, and that's where it gets frustrating for the public, I'm sure. But most of the time, I mean, given if I mean, that's what I do. I go right to peer reviewed papers, and and usually I have a sense of what are the top journals in a particular field. So they're still more reliable than just the random source on the internet.
YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now in its 5th season, the Athens West Theater Company begins the Season of Hope. Brighton Beach Memoirs, the classic by Neil Simon, will run from October 4th through the 20th. Please visit Athens West on Facebook or at their website at athenswest.net, or call 859-425-2550. There's something about my house that holds the past. My body holds spirit in similar stead, memorizes in cells with potential flame, ghosts of the worlds by flesh and bone fed. The walls of this room are my heart's strength, the sink my blood that flows with fire. The bedroom holds my resting bones, the brick my flesh and fair attire. Find these poems and many more at lulu.com, L-U-L-U, lulu.com, under Charles Sebastian, Seasons of the Centaur, available at lulu.com.
I had a question about, could you give us the pros and cons? There's such a big thing about just bringing it down to a local level about buying organic versus not.
Right.
Could you give us your feelings on that and pros and cons?
Sure. I actually buy organic and I buy conventional. I do both, and I support organic farmers. I support conventional farmers. So I tend to see value in both systems. Not that I see value in pollution effects from conventional farming, but we can still, you can still run into the same thing with organic production systems. So to me, my preference is to try to find and promulgate farming practices that are beneficial to each type of farming system that growers want to use. And so that includes organic, that includes conventional, and that includes all kind, ecological and all these other farming systems that go by different names. I actually think there are things that lots of good ideas in organic farming, certainly good ideas in conventional farming, and that probably an amalgam is maybe for me the best approach. But for right now, it becomes a bit more divisive than I think is useful. But that's what people are, and people make their choices.
Whenever I get into that conversation with someone, it's usually the pesticide issue that they're citing as their main reason for not so much support of local farmers as much as the pesticide.
Yeah.
And so, could you tell us, is that something to worry about big time? Or,
great question. I've worked with fungicides, tested their qualities, their performance, and for how many years? Since I really started in 1983, so however many years that is, 37 or something like that, but 36. But it's a great question. I will say, this is one reason why I like genetic engineering, because it gives us non-pesticidal alternatives for disease control.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, my files are full of studies that have not been commercialized, but have, we've got the technology, if the public will accept the genetic engineering. So I'm not in favor of pesticides. I think they can be very useful in large farming systems. Organic growers use pesticides, not as many as conventional farmers, but they have their own subset of pesticides that they use, and I think if we rule out pesticides, and we rule out advanced genetics, we're really not leaving very much for breeders and farmers to work with. Yeah, we're
like the palette just shrunk down.
Yeah, the palette just pretty small now. So are they safe pesticides now? I think that's part of an implied part of your answer or your question. Generally, I've been very impressed with the regulatory approach to pesticides over the decades, and I was required to know this when I was in my PhD program. One of my professors, he said, draw a fungicide chemical structure on the board, any structure, and of course I didn't prepare for that, so I was like, oh no. But for the next exam I was ready, and so I was, I said, which one do you want me to draw? But my point, and he challenged me to know about risk assessment. How is it that we decide whether or not pesticides are safe? And that's the process of risk assessment. So for decades, I've accepted that challenge and tried to understand how EPA, for example, decides if a pesticide is safe or not. And most of my career, I would have said that EPA does an excellent job in testing and assuring the safety of pesticides. There've been one or two examples recently where I've been somewhat disappointed in EPA's approach, but on the whole, over time, especially, I think EPA's done a very good job of keeping us safe, but and keeping the environment safe. But there are impacts in the environment from pesticide use, and not as many as there were in the days of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's classic book, but it'd be better if we didn't need them at all. And that's why I loop back to this concept that really genetics is our best pathway to reducing and eliminating pesticides. It's our best pathway. I'm telling you, I'm a plant pathologist. I've taught introductory plant pathology for years. I know what I'm talking about. Genetics is the way to go if we will allow ourselves to go that way.
Yeah. So there might be a little bit of something bad with genetics, but it pales in comparison to these other things. Is what you're saying? Yeah,
and a little bit bad about genetics is it's. Let's go back to the. Because I'm focusing in on that because this is a subject that comes up. Is this stuff safe? And
well, I can see people commenting on the podcast and saying, "Well, what about this about genetics?"
Yeah.
So that's why I posed the question.
It's a good lead. Yeah, it's a good lead in. So genetics is, think back to the example of the copy and the pasting the sentence. You, the listener, know that you can copy a sentence and paste it into another file, and it doesn't create a hazard. It may make that file read better, worse, or it may be indifferent, right? But it doesn't create a particular hazard to copy and paste a sentence, right? That's what that's genetics. And again, this is vetted by genomics experts. I'm telling you this analogy has been peer reviewed. What matters in genetics is not what you copy and paste it. It's what it does.
So something like the BT protein.
Yep.
I know it's like not hazardous to like our intestine or digestive tract now, but after 30 years of exposure or something, is there any concern long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the BT protein is, as you know, but for the benefit of listeners, is an anti-insect protein that comes from a gene from a bacteria. And so, is there any long-term risk to consuming the protein? I just point to the studies that have been done. Those include rather long-term studies. I don't think there's any way to absolutely be sure about whether there wouldn't be some long-term effects, but I think the same. What is the long-term effect of eating any pesticide or any food? If you think about it, we've not conquered cancer, and if you think back, let's take a crop production system of 100 years ago. People were dying of young 100 years ago. So was that the food?
Still dying of their teeth.
What?
Still dying of their teeth. a lot of
Yeah,
times.
yeah, all kinds of things. So I don't know if I guess I don't know if I'm really directly answering your question. I think I am. There's no way to there's no way to absolutely be sure of the long-term effects, but I would rather take my chances on genetics personally
I think I would too.
than chemical
Yeah.
science. Yeah.
Well, and it might be sort of a question of the future, and it's hard to know that because there's so many variables.
Right.
Really, I mean, if you were back in 1955 and you said, "Wow, people were consuming 1/10 the sugar that they do nowadays, and obesity rates were much, much, much lower," and you would say, "Well, should we actually introduce that much refined sugar into the food? And we know it sweetens it, and we know it sells more candy bars and more everything else, but should we do this?
This
Are
is
we
complex
culpable in any
stuff.
sense?"
Yeah, exactly.
So but who would have known that it would have ballooned up into this obesity issue
Yeah.
and peripherally disease?
Yep.
So
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and
But I'm with you. I'd rather roll the dice on
Yeah,
Yeah.
genetics.
and they do get tested. Another thing, maybe just to put it in perspective, genetically engineered crops are tested very heavily. Why? Because there's a lot of liability out there, and so companies do animal feeding studies. They do a lot of different types of testing for safety for genetically engineered crops. Do you know what they're required to report for conventionally produced crops? Nothing. There are no required tests. You must sell safe food. That FDA requires that all food be in the marketplace be safe. But there's no protocol. There's no requirement for what to do to test your conventionally bred corn or soybeans or whatever.
There's some burden of responsibility on the consumer as well. I think to be aware of what you're eating.
Well, that's a good point too. Yeah, but I'm arguing on behalf of the fact that genetically engineered crops do actually get tested very rigorously in comparison to crops that are assumed, that conventional crops are assumed to be safe because they're conventional. Well, but that's not a valid assumption. There are several examples of poisonous crops on the marketplace, crops that were naturally poisonous, and they were all conventionally bred.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So genetics had nothing to do with it aside from naturally occurring genetics.
Exactly. Aside from naturally occurring genetics. Yep.
Wow.
Yep. If you want to look up the one that comes to mind, there are three. There's celery, a case of celery, a case of potato, a case of squash. It was one of the cucurbits. I think it was squash. But look up the case of the poisoned potato, and it's pretty easy to find on the internet.
How do they go about eliminating that after they were aware of it?
They do a better job of testing potatoes for those neurotoxins. There are natural neurotoxins in potatoes, but the dose has been bred to be low through human selection. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's something that if those potatoes had been genetically modified, that would have been caught by
By the company. Yeah, I would hope so. I would expect so. Yeah.
But a lot of the testing and the liability issues surrounding the genetically modified stuff. I mean, the testing is done more for the liability issue. I'm assuming. Right?
Yeah, it's done for liability, and they know a lot of attention's being placed on these and when you talk, when you talk to people who are producing genetically engineered crops, they're like you and me. They don't want to go home and have a fitful night trying to go to sleep because what they're doing is harmful to people. They're just honest people.
Killed 40 people or something.
Yeah, we killed only 40 today, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what sells me on it. Because, if somebody somewhere's going to do it. If the scientific community got together and said, hey, we're not going to do this because there are ethical issues, someone somewhere is still going to do it.
Yeah.
I'd rather somebody with some ethics and controlled environment research that than somebody who isn't.
Yeah, and so to follow on your point, what worries me is not genetic engineering of crops, because again, I think there's a lot of value and a lot of attention paid to the safety issue. What worries me is genetic engineering of microorganisms for bioterrorism purposes, and so you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
What's that?
I hadn't even considered.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If it can be done, somebody will try to do it, and so that I think is a much higher concern for me.
And how difficult is it to do
Genetic engineering?
Yeah, I mean regarding something that would create, something would qualify as a terrorist
hazard.
threat.
Yeah. Well, CRISPR is often represented as being relatively straightforward technology to employ in the lab. There are people that have received advanced degrees in molecular biology all over the world. It doesn't take very many to go off and start a lab, in some protected place, in some country that's favorable to terrorism, and
get paid enough and have to get paid enough, or find somebody that has a big agenda for terrorism.
Ideological agenda of some sort. I think the military and intelligence services are that's a big challenge for them.
So that's probably something. If you're going to fear anything, it's probably that would be more fearful than these crops are going out that have been genetically modified, and that's like from a scientist's point
absolutely.
of view. It's like
that is my totally. I don't worry about it every night, but I do. If I'm going to pick a concern with genetic engineering, that the bioterrorism rises pretty high for me.
Yeah.
Probably to the top.
Like you think about that before, hey, I'm biting into corn and I'm worried about it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm going to ask you another potentially heated question.
Oh, sure.
I'm sure this will generate a lot of controversy. Yeah. Please give us your take on the global warming issue.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Glad to have somebody ask about it. Actually, I don't talk about it much because I've been frustrated by it.
And please, I don't know about you, but for me, I don't know. I mean, I hear what's perpetuated in the media and from Al Gore and all these other things, but as far as the science of it, I really have not heard from a scientist.
Sure.
There may be some GMO-related solutions to that.
Yeah, there are.
Really?
Actually,
Okay.
I'll jump to that and say you're right. Climate change, global warming. So probably the most powerful thing I could say on this, at least for me as a scientist, is I went to several climate science conferences, scientific conferences, and including the 2012 American Geophysical Union meeting, which is where the premier climate science work is reported, typically. And so I got to be in the room listening to these esteemed experts, and hear the reaction to their talks. So that's where you really, even if you're not a scientist, you could tell if a talk is well received or not based on the reactions.
Right.
You don't have to know what they're saying. You just have to look at the body language and the wagging of fingers and whatever, right? I had drinks with Andy Dessler, one of the most well-known atmospheric chemists. Man, it was a great time with him. I had a drink with a rocket scientist, of all things, or a satellite scientist, and I talked, and I sort of looked at the posters, and I talked to the scientists who were reporting their work at the posters. This is for real. This phenomenon is for real. It's largely caused by human activity. The science is very solid on these points. It is very solid, and it's quite discouraging to see, quote, debates taking place about something that's so well established. It's like debating whether the people have been to the moon or not. It's solid science, and Now, what we do, how quickly it will progress, is of course a matter of study, and who studies that? Who has the best knowledge of that range of possibilities? Climate scientists do. So you don't have to go outside of climate scientists to get the truth. It's the range of possibilities that face us. It is being studied by climate scientists, and that is what they do, is study these phenomena. I think we're really screwing up. I think humanity is really screwing up.
And when you say that it's affected largely by human activity,
Yeah.
is that just through, I don't want to use the word overpopulation, but because the population is so much more than it was at one time? Or
Well, yes, partly because 7 billion plus people can generate a lot of carbon.
Right.
Yeah, so it's partly that.
one big footprint.
One big footprint. But partly it's due to the fact that we have, and I say we, I'm including myself, we have so many ways of generating carbon. And when I walk into a warm plant science building in the middle of winter, I'm thankful that we have, the energy system that we do that keep me warm. So I want to own that right up front. And I know that we're screwing up on this issue. I don't think there are easy answers, but we're not talking about, we're not putting our heads together to try to figure out what works for the majority of Americans. We're still pretending that it's not happening.
Like there's a debate on whether or not it exists.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that's distracting us from, sometimes some of the best ideas for fighting climate change have come from people that are of an ideological bent. You think they should be denying climate change, but in fact they say, well, no, climate change is real, but I want a conservative solution. So here's what I propose. So I'll get into use labels here for just a minute. So a lot of times climate change is perceived as a debate between liberals and conservatives, right? And liberals think it's happening, conservatives think it's not. And that is so far afield from where we should be going. We should be agreeing on what the science says, and the science is very clear. It's largely rapid climate change on a geological scale. Rapid climate change is occurring, and it's largely due to human activities, including mine. We should move beyond that false debate and say, okay, here are my solutions. I'm a liberal. I'm just being anybody, Mr. Anybody, and I'm a liberal, and these are my solutions. And then Mr. Conservative says, I'm a conservative, and these are my solutions. And together, let's see where
Let's have a powwow.
Let's have a powwow, and even if it takes years. But there are some really good ideas. So a lot of times conservatives deny that this is happening, when in fact conservatives have some of the best long-term ideas for addressing the issue. So that's where we need to be. And I don't talk much about climate change anymore. I used to give talks on it, and they were good talks. They were very science-based, but people are not interested in the topic, and so I just don't talk about it unless they ask. But it's a real issue, very real issue for us.
At some point, we saw this shift in nomenclature from global warming to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So has there been some kind of change in thinking that goes along with that? Is it still a warming issue?
No, it's global warming is still a good phrase to describe the phenomenon.
So that's still
the problem with that is that it suggests that tomorrow should be warmer than today, when there's still weather, right? There's still variability in the atmosphere, and so you get cold weather, and you can get snow in March in Lexington, and so where's the global warming, right? Well, it's still there. This is variability in day-to-day weather. So climate change. Some scientists like the term. Some scientists like the term climate change because it's more encompassing, because you can actually get, as a result of climate change, you can get or global warming, you can get maybe cooling in certain parts of the Earth. Most are warming, but maybe you can get a cooling in this little part of the Earth.
May be the result of warming
In other locations, right. So some scientists like climate change as a more comprehensive term, but they're not trying to run away from global warming. It still is probably the best description of this phenomenon. And the globe is warming. If you take the average global land surface temperature and ocean surface temperature, it is warming. There's no doubt.
So my other question is, how much at this point do they think is caused by people, and how much is it a natural cycle?
Yeah, largely there's some uncertainty and some discussion about that. But I'm going to give you my best figure, knowing I could find it, more precisely. But it's somewhere in the range of at least 2/3 is human driven, and that would be conservative. Scientists tend to be conservative, not politically necessarily, but conservative in their statements. And so there are quite a few that would say no, it's more like 90%. Yeah.
And this is cumulative between like carbon emissions, just human activity in terms of hey, we eat, and then this all goes back to the atmosphere, deforestation.
Absolutely.
And then is there an exponential effect in terms of, you have like say polar ice caps melting a little bit more.
Oh yeah.
And you see and you hear, and this is the favorite thing with the people who are very, very, very much talking about.
Right.
About species being driven further south, like the polar bear and that kind of thing, or further north. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Further toward the pole. Right.
Right.
And I think I'm correct in saying
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Or up the mountain.
Up the mountain. Yeah. Where it's so. Is there a cumulative effect as like it continues on? It will increase exponentially.
Yeah. So what you're describing are what are called feedbacks, and so feedbacks can be negative, that is slow down warming, or positive, that is speed up warming. And so, the feedback, a positive feedback of global warming would be as the ice cap in the North Pole, the ice cap, as warming progresses, the ice cap shrinks. Mm-hmm. We're measuring that. It does happen. And as the ice cap shrinks, the Earth can't reflect as much light as it used to back into space. So that would be a positive feedback. Warming causes the ice to shrink. Shrinking ice causes Earth to capture more warming.
This may be
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Because with the ice, it would be more reflective, and the greenhouse effect wouldn't be as strong.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you got that going on. That's an example of a positive feedback.
This may be a dumb question, but is there any concern about, as you lose mass at the caps, it changing the axis of the Earth?
No, I have not heard of that as a concern. What does pop into mind, though, as a concern is there are well-established deep ocean currents. These circulatory systems within, of water draining down to the bottom of the ocean and then moving along the bottom of the ocean for thousands of miles and then coming up over here. Those ocean currents there's concern that as warming progresses, that they'll suddenly tip into a new state, and it'll change the distribution and redistribution of heat on the planet. So, and that if that happens, that's bad news for parts of the world yet undetermined. It could be, England is so mild, even though it's so far north, because of the warmth that's carried north from the Gulf of Mexico in this part of the world. And if that system of movement of ocean waters is disrupted, they could become like the Arctic.
Greenland.
Yeah, exactly. It could turn into Greenland in a few decades. Yeah.
So that current that goes from the Gulf of Mexico, like the transatlantic currents.
I forget the names, but yeah,
It goes
something
across,
like
and it actually serves to warm England more than it would be
yes,
if that did not exist.
Exactly.
Like, it'd probably be much colder.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's really a shotgun of stuff that could happen.
Yeah,
if that,
and we don't know which ones, if any, will happen, but it's risky. It's very risky what we're doing.
Has the science been going long enough to be able to see if the currents have changed on their own, or?
I don't think there's evidence that they have.
Okay, so pretty much for at least the entirety of since the scientific revolution, there's been
No change.
No change.
As far as we know.
Since you've actually been watching it.
Right. Correct.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's creepy.
I know.
Yeah. It's creepy and amazing at the same time.
Here's another one. Another positive feedback. The Arctic has these vast landscapes that trap methane in a frozen state underground, and as warming progresses down into the permafrost and below, you can warm those up enough that they start escaping. I mean, if you've never seen this, there are pictures of scientists igniting these plumes of methane coming out of the ground.
Wow.
And so, like, methane's a potent greenhouse gas. No, there's no indication that enough of that has been released to cause dramatic damage, but there's this concern that, like, some big deposit somewhere will suddenly start
change
leaking.
the breathable air somehow, or
Just produce a lot of methane, which is a powerful warming gas. It's like CO2, only like 100 times more potent as a trapper of heat.
So it can make the warming that's already occurring kind of
Bump it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I said 100 times. It might be 25 times, but it's much more potent than CO2, and so every little bit does get scientists' attention.
At Kyojuteru Kempo, we believe that everyone has the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. Violence can visit us despite age, race, or gender. Call us at Kyojuteru Kempo or check us out at kyojuteru.org. kyojuteru.org. Hello, I'm Chip Sebastian. I am the co-host of Sebastian and Sierp. If you've been liking the shows, please click like down below. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, jump on over to YouTube, click subscribe, and you will get the most recent episodes of our show where we're interviewing all kinds of great and interesting people. So we're looking forward to a lot more shows. Stay tuned. It's rolling. Just begun.
I was thinking the other day, sometime back I did this article for a magazine concerning artificial sweeteners and how they have affected, our food intake, and of course how they've affected the food that we grow. And so what I learned when I was researching that was about the unnamed artificial sweeteners that a lot of us use being 200 to 300 times sweeter than what naturally occurs in, say, corn, just natural corn.
Yeah, that sounds similar to what I've read too.
Right, and so as a result, a lot of obesity has come about not only through sugar consumption, but because our taste buds are literally saying, hey, you just had something 200 times sweeter than that corn you ate the other day, and as a result, I want something a lot more salty now. So the body goes and says, okay, salt, and so on, back and forth in this vicious loop, where the body is almost on hyperdrive, trying to compete between salty and sweet, and then the sort of the lesser put out, like astringents and other things that are part of a good diet that don't get talked about. It's really salty and sweet tends to be the North American
salt,
diet.
sweet, and fat.
And fat, So I guess the question that I have on it is, do you see that really affecting the way things are grown? I mean, are crop yields made sweeter in order to make them more palatable? And do you see that being? I mean, it's almost rhetorical, but do you see that being a huge problem in terms of human disease and such, given that we were eating this very mild, just what we needed diet for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden in the last 50 to 80 years, it's skyrocketed into these vast consumptions, driven largely by this.
Yeah, the taste.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good topic, and probably one I would be interested in learning more about, so I should take a look at your article. I have a good colleague upstairs, Michael Gooden. He's a good friend and a good scientist, and a passionate foodie, I guess, if there is such a thing, right? Mm-hmm. He's a great, actually, might be something for you to consider interviewing. He's a great.
Sure.
I think he's the next Michael Pollan. I keep telling him that. But,
yeah.
So, but anyway, he sort of over and over reiterates the notion of fat, salt, and sugar, and sugar, sweetness. Fat, salt, and sugar. That's what's driving the obesity epidemic. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah. So anyway, yeah. I don't know that it has much to do with how crops are produced, but post production, once you get into the processing and the marketing, mm-hmm. Yeah, you find sugar in places you just don't even think it. It's there.
Well, if you like say 100 years ago, if you didn't have any products of any kind or foods that were being made that contained a lot of high fructose corn syrup, for instance.
Yeah.
And nowadays, like 80% of what we eat has that to some degree.
Yeah.
Therefore, it must affect, I'm assuming, the crop yields for corn in order to produce it.
You mean are people growing more corn?
Right.
Oh, sure.
In order to keep up with that demand or that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a market. Yeah. There's a market for it, so people.
Yeah. So it does really affect how much is being consumed in that sense. I mean, not so much how many corn cobs are getting on the table, but how much of this stuff is being produced in order to have certain extractions and certain things
to meet the market.
As additives.
Yeah. So, the biggest uses of corn are still animal feed and exported for animal feed too. And biofuels, but quite a bit is produced for industrial uses, and that includes corn syrup. So it does play into that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on? I mean, just getting back to the carbon footprint. What are your thoughts on alternate fuel sources?
Okay, boy, that's a good one too. Yeah, you're asking me things that I've studied, but I'm thinking, oh God, am I going to remember enough to give him a good answer? So, you like biofuels? Well, the biodiesel and ethanol from corn, ethanol from sugarcane in Brazil. They tend not to have as much offsetting benefit on the carbon footprint as we like to think. I think that's pretty solid in the scientific literature. We had higher hopes for global warming reductions through these alternate biofuels than actually we've achieved, because what happens is if you're growing for the biofuels market, you might plow out pasture which was capturing carbon and use it in corn production, which is
so the carbon's getting in there anyway.
So the carbon's getting into the system, anyway. So that's one of the disadvantages of the alternate fuels, is they don't really seem to give us very much benefit in terms of carbon reductions. But those are called first generation biofuels. Second generation biofuels would be those that are derived from cellulose. So like shrubbery or something like that. Things that you wouldn't be able to feed normally. Their use is for feed normally. It, can be used to generate fuels, but they're not very good at generating fuels. It's hard to.
They're less efficient. You mean?
It's just hard to turn that cellulose that makes the wood.
Mm-hmm.
The thing you call wood is made up of largely cellulose. It's hard to turn that cellulose into fuel.
Okay, just the
Yeah.
process.
Just the process.
Too costly or too time intensive.
We don't have the
labor-intensive.
technology at the cost.
don't-
Yeah, we
I
just
got
don't
you.
have that.
Okay.
Someday we may. So someday, second generation biofuels may actually be economical, but we're not there yet. So
And do you feel that's the same with, say, like solar and nuclear power and hydroelectric and all the other various fuel sources that people
I
say
see.
we ought to convert to these things
yeah,
to save the planet?
Yeah.
But
I think I think we should be moving in that direction, but each of them present challenges, so there's no easy answers.
yeah, so it's just hard to know.
Yeah, no easy answers for sure.
Gotcha.
One thing I want to tie back into, so we're kind of get back on the topic, are the GMO solutions to
Sure.
global warming.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah,
Genetically modifying trees to consume more carbon, or
Mhm.
something like that.
Right. Oh yeah, sure. Actually, a lot of things we can do with genetic engineering would help us adapt our crops to, or our forest trees to climate change. So, heat tolerance in crops that are not quite so heat tolerant. That's one possibility. Warming is associated sometimes with certain additional insect or disease problems that didn't exist before, and if that's the case, then having genetic solutions to resist the insect or the disease are possibilities. Yeah, a lot of times in these papers, there was a study that I've forgotten the details of what they did, but they engineered rice to somehow to produce less methane in the paddies than normal rice. And methane is a greenhouse gas, like I mentioned before, a rather potent greenhouse gas. So there's lots of literature, scientific literature, on all these little ways, plug in all these different ideas for reducing global warming impact, as well as global production of greenhouse gases through genetics. There's quite a few.
Do you feel that, say, like we're fast forward, again, this is more speculative, but in another 30 years or so, do you feel that we will be eating differently, or things will be, from the research and all the things that we're finding? I mean, do you feel like it? Because to me, we live in an odd time. I mean, I can drive down the road and you have one person screaming organic everything. Drive a mile up the road and you got, a guy buying his 5 kids, gummy bears, and the whole grocery cart's full of sugar-laden stuff.
Yeah.
So we're in this real strange thing where if we were tribal from 200 years ago, we probably would all be eating off the same deer.
That's right.
Right. So do you see, just sort of from a social and cultural, since food sort of ties us all together in some sense.
Yeah.
And of course plants are the foundation of that, really. Do you see that moving in a certain direction?
Well, I definitely would agree that it'd be wonderful to see people eating maybe a more healthy diet. I mean, only 10% of Americans get 5 vegetables or fruits a day. I mean, that's we're not treating ourselves very well through our food. So I hope for a more healthy diet. I anticipate, as I said before, genetic engineering will be a tool that people allow in their food systems. I also would. This comes down to choice, so I'm not arguing against choice, free choice, and I respect choices food choices. And we know that one's diet can have an impact, a small impact, because we're just one person, right? But there's ways to reduce our global warming impact through our diet as well. And in fact, Judy and I, my wife and I, enjoy eating the foods that are generally low impact kinds of meals, and we just, it's very, very possible to have a delicious meal that has less global warming impact than, say, that 24-ounce steak that
It's a family steak.
It's a family size. Yeah, but yeah. So anyway, yeah, those are just some comments.
Now in its 5th season, the Athens West Theater Company begins the Season of Hope. Brighton Beach Memoirs, the classic by Neil Simon, will run from October 4th through the 20th. Please visit Athens West on Facebook or at their website at athenswest.net, or call 859-425-2550. A castle under the silver moon hovering by the sea that pounds below the thundering sky to infinity. A maiden in the castle keep, her hero in the moat. A girl who for her lover weeps, armed guards in every boat. Find these poems and many more at lulu.com, L-U-L-U, lulu.com, under Charles Sebastian, Seasons of the Centaur, available at lulu.com.
So, what are your feelings on the legalization of marijuana?
That's a should question, right?
It's a what?
It's a should question, right? Should we legalize it?
Not necessarily. I just, do you think that Kentucky will fall in lockstep with other states who have gone that route? And
yeah. And I actually honestly don't have an opinion.
Don't have an opinion. Yeah. I mean, some people feel like it inevitably will happen.
You mean as a medication?
As a medication.
Medical use. Yeah. Well, if it can help with people's suffering, I'm biased in that favor. That's sort of my first thought, is if we can help people reduce their suffering, it's going to be hard to talk me out of that, but that's my initial thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, Paul, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It was a real blast.
Yeah, it was good.
And we're so glad to have Dr. Paul Vincelli with us this time round. We hope you all enjoyed the show a great deal. See us next time on Sebastian and Sierp, and be looking for our future episodes. I believe, I'm not sure who's on next, but we've got a lot of good people coming on. So stay tuned, and we'll be back.
Hello, I'm Chip Sebastian. I am the co-host of Sebastian and Sierp. If you've been liking the shows, please click like down below. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, jump on over to YouTube, click subscribe, and you will get the most recent episodes of our show, where we're interviewing all kinds of great and interesting people. So we're looking forward to a lot more shows. Stay tuned. It's rolling. Just begun.